I'd like to introduce the members of our panel. These are filmmakers who have tried to do something that I think, failed in TV news to do. I was an NBC News correspondent for 42 years, and I covered the LA riots in '92, and as a matter of fact, I am so old that I covered Watts in '65 as a 22-year-old, freshly minted, wet behind the ears reporter for a local TV station. So I've been to this dance a couple of times, and the thought I had when we were on the streets in '92 was, we sure haven't learned a hell of a lot about race relations in this city in 27 years. First of all, Sasha Jenkins, the gentleman across from me, is a very multi-talented individual, filmmaker, writer, musician, artist, graffiti historian, hip-hop analyst, born in Philly, raised in New York. He founded Ego Trip magazine, and that spawned a number of TV productions, including The White Rapper Show. He also wrote and directed the 2015 documentary Fresh Dressed, chronicling the history of hip-hop and the fashion it inspired. His film about the LA riots for Showtime is called, and I ask your forgiveness for using a term that George Carlin said you could never use on TV, Burn, Motherfucker, Burn. Film critic Sheila O'Malley wrote, Jenkins attempts to break down the various intersections of cultural and social history in Los Angeles that helped create such a constantly exploding powder keg. And here is a clip from Sasha's film. The Oscar-winning duo of Daniel Lindsay and T.J. Martin, opposite each other on these two couches here, are co-directors of LA '92, which screened here in April and aired on the National Geographic Channel. I think they've shown the movie all over the country, too, in various places that are still troubled by racial strife. T.J. also edited the film. I believe, Dan, you also did. You were both editors on the film. Their Oscar came for their 2011 documentary, Undefeated, about three underprivileged kids from Memphis and the coach who tries to help them turn their lives around. About LA '92, film critic Kenneth Turan of the LA Times wrote, by sifting through and tying together an enormous variety of footage, directors Lindsay and Martin create an experience that gives a full sense of the anarchy and rage of the post-King verdict days, thrusting us fully and disturbingly into events in very much of a you-are-there manner. And here's a look at LA '92. Grace Lee brings us K-Town '92, which is billed as an interactive web documentary. It includes a short film, K-Town '92 Reporters, that aired on PBS World, and a website that I encourage you all to visit. It's at ktown92.com, and it's quite immersive, and I found myself lingering on it for a long time. Grace is the daughter of Korean immigrants, born in Columbia, Missouri, where her dad taught at the University of Missouri. She has said that her mission is to paint a picture of Asian American lives with insight and honesty. Her previous films include The Grace Lee Project, American Revolutionary, The Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs, Barrier Device, and the mockumentary, American Zombie. In K-Town '92, Grace said she's trying to critique the media coverage of the uprising and amplify other stories about Koreatown, which she considers a very vibrant immigrant community. Here is a sample of K-Town '92. Justin Chon is a Korean-American actor-director who's well known to fans of the Twilight movies, where he played Eric Yorkie. Raised in Irvine, Justin has directed 4 films, the short You're Stupid and Full Circle, the feature comedy Man Up, and the dramatic film we're going to be discussing tonight, Gook, and soon he is going to be in the ABC series Deception, filming in New York. As Justin explains in the film, Gook is a Korean word meaning land or country. Hanguk is Korea, Miguk is the good old USA, right? And unfortunately, that word has been bastardized and kind of vulgarized into a slur aimed at most Asian Americans. I certainly remember hearing it from GIs in Vietnam a whole lot when referring to the Vietnamese. Justin says the overarching message of the film is, look what happens when we don't talk to each other. He plays a young Korean American who's trying to run a struggling shoe store. In 1992, he and his brother form an unlikely friendship with a streetwise 11-year-old African American girl named Camilla, who ditches school and hangs out with the brothers. And then the violence begins. Here's a sample of the film Gook. And I might add that Gook is going to be in limited release come August. So let me do a quick go-around with the panel. Our presentation is titled State of Emergency 25 Years After the LA Riots. Others prefer to call it an uprising or a rebellion or a revolt. What's your preferred label? Sasha? There you go.
Uprising.
Uprising. Okay, why uprising?
Well, what's the other term you asked me if I wanted to use?
Rebellion, revolt, uprising?
Rebellion feels more like you just stepped on my shoes and, you know, now I want to get you, you know. Uprising, to me, feels like something that's been building gradually and gradually, more and more gradually over time. It's not a spontaneous combustion of rage. It's something that has been building for generations.
All right.
So.
Okay, Justin, what would you like to call it?
I'd probably have to agree with Sasha. It's an uprising. But, you know, growing up, it was always referred to as a riot. And, I mean, I feel like a riot doesn't always have to have a reason that's been building for decades. So I think an uprising is something that it also means a lot more, too.
Yep. Dan, what would you call it?
I mean, we'll have the same answer. We always refer to it when making it as a civil disturbance, but we just took that language from the official report that came out afterwards, and we chose to do that because we didn't want to make a judgment on that by, you know, a lot of different people in a lot of different communities refer to, as you're suggesting here by the question, in different ways, and we were trying to find the way to not bring our judgment on it.
It's also part of the, I mean, that was kind of where our heads were at in the approach of the film. So I don't know if you fully clarified, our LA 92 specifically is built solely out of archival materials. So there are, it's not like a couple of interviews, there are 0 interviews. And the intention is to, there's a number of them, but one of which is to kind of preserve the emotional integrity of some of the more, not just disturbing imagery, but some of the more kind of humanistic imagery, and not have it filtered through someone else's lens. You can have that conversation, you yourself, your audience, with the film itself. And so a big part of our process was always, it would always be civil disturbance or civil unrest, because it felt, not in the bad way, it felt the most neutral that was able to accommodate everybody's different experience.
Grace, what would you call it?
I call it a lot of different things too, depending on, because my film is it's many different things, but there's a lot of interviews with people from many different communities, and depending on how they refer to it, I just, you know, to some people it's a rebellion, to some people it's an uprising, it's a civil unrest. But I actually prefer, although I don't use it often because most people don't know what it is in Korean it's Taegu, which means the actual date, 429. And in Korea, there's a lot of huge events that are referred to as the actual dates, like 625. Yu-Gi-Oh! 625 is the beginning of the Korean War. You know, Oilpa is like the beginning of the Gwangju Uprising, which was this big event where the government massacred a bunch of civilians. So Taegu just has that, like, you know, it doesn't, it was a huge event, uprising, rebellion, you know, major turning point in history for everybody. And so I like to call it that for myself, but most people don't know what it means.
Does 429 carry the same kind of lingering trauma as 9/11?
Yeah, it's very much like 9/11.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sasha, TJ pointed out that they didn't go out and interview anybody about the events of the past. You did. And you heard his explanation that they didn't want to interrupt the flow and filter it through the views of other people. Why did you do all those interviews you did for your piece?
Well, I want to say, when I got commissioned to make this film, I didn't know that there were 6 or 7 other people making similar films. So there's a level of you know, the hip hop in me is very competitive, but at the end of the day, I wanted to do something that served history. So their explanation for the words they chose in which to describe the film and their approach to the film, I think, is brilliant, because the idea of capturing, you know, the moment and seizing the moment and having it from that time capsule and putting it together is brilliant. And for my contribution to this overall conversation that all of us here and others have had because of the so-called anniversary, I don't want to say that I had an agenda, but as an African American, I have very particular feelings based on my experiences. So as someone who grew up on the East Coast and knew nothing about West Coast black and brown life outside of rap music, I always listened to the music and I appreciated it, but I always felt like, what are these guys pissed off about? They have houses and good weather and they can have barbecues. I always wanted to grow up in a house. You know, I grew up in an apartment. So when I got to doing the research and learning all of these things, like, you know, the shooting at a mosque, you know, where black men were consciously shot in the penis by police officers, when you look at the very systematic ways in which law enforcement and the system has been historically dealing with folks of color in Los Angeles, which is a microcosm for America, you know, my film is called Burn Motherfucker Burn for a reason. You know, I have a very specific tonal sort of idea that I want to express, and that is, I want people to understand, because I wasn't here in '92, to be honest. I was on the phone with some unnamed rappers, because I was a music journalist at the time, getting play-by-plays over the phone and watching it on TV, but I wasn't here. So I wanted to make a film that helped people to understand why black people were pissed off. And going back to your initial question of whether it's a riot or a rebellion or an uprising, it was happening because these things kept happening over and over again. And so I wanted to convey that feeling, that sentiment, and that energy. And so that's, I don't know if I'm even answering your question at this point, but that's kind of what I was going for.
You spend about an hour of your 90-some minutes in that film going back and retracing the whole African-American migration to L.A., the people who wanted to escape the Jim Crow laws of the South, looking for a better life in California, and they had this kind of dream, didn't they? And the dream was squashed by the LAPD. They thought they would find freedom and a better life here, and they found a measure of oppression because of the paramilitary tactics employed by the LAPD.
Yeah, I mean, America has a very passive-aggressive relationship with quote-unquote African Americans. If we were considered Americans, we wouldn't be called African Americans, and we'd have the same rights that Americans have.
Yeah.
And so, of course, you would see palm trees and great weather and California, you know, fresh fruit and all these great things that you guys have. Of course, you have this expectation as an American that you can also buy into that program, and then you get here and you realize that the ghosts that you were trying to escape from followed you. You know, they're like a shadow. And, you know, this shadow remains to this day.
Grace, Sasha talked about the kind of American dream that black people had when they came here. Korean Americans and Korean immigrants harbor that same dream. A lot of them came here, opened businesses, many of them serving the black community, but there was friction between the Korean community and the black community. And I'm thinking about the shooting of a girl named Latasha Harlins that happened right about the same time as the Rodney King beating. And the Korean shopkeeper who killed her was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, but handed a sentence that was basically 5 years probation, I think a $500 fine and no jail time. And that really angered blacks. So when
It angered a lot of Korean people too.
Yeah.
I mean, myself included. I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm thinking that when the uprising broke out in '92, a lot of Korean businesses were targeted for looting and arson, and a lot of people thought that was payback for the Latasha Harlins thing. And then we saw all those very disturbing images of Korean shopkeepers armed to the teeth, defending their businesses. Was there kind of, you think, a kind of a stereotype of Koreans as being mean guys with guns who would shoot first and ask questions later? What was, you know, when you talk about the media portrayal of Koreans, what was wrong with it?
Many things. I mean,
Yeah.
I really appreciate what Sasha's saying, like the same, you know, African Americans, you know, it's similar to immigrants who come here and, you know, having different expectations of how they're going to live. And for a lot of Korean Americans, I mean, Haegu was that moment, sort of that day of reckoning when they realized, oh, you know, I'll just tell you a brief story. I didn't grow up in LA either. I've lived here like for the past 20-some years, but I was actually not here either. I was in Korea, and I was watching the uprising unfold on television there, which was incredibly surreal because I'd never been to Koreatown before, but I suddenly saw images of Koreatown burning on television, and I saw images of hysterical women and, you know, men, immigrants who owned stores in tears because their business had been just devastated. I saw images of men with guns shooting randomly at whoever they were. And it was in Korea, it was actually called a Black Riot on the news. It was referred to as Black Riot, which was also incredibly disturbing to me. And when I came back to the US, I sort of entered into this world of like, what does it mean, this Korean black conflict? And I get asked this question a lot too. I mean, I think that there is only a certain kind of image that was afforded to Korean Americans through media, whether it was like the immigrant who lost everything, or you know, the woman who shot and murdered Latasha Harlins, or men with guns defending their American dream. And I think there's a lot of gray area and a lot of stories that weren't covered that tell different stories. And one of the reasons I specifically wanted to make something called K-Town 92 is to explore, you know, from a different perspective, what is that experience? And, you know, just like South LA is not a monolithic black community, Koreatown is not a monolithic Korean community. There's, in fact, most of these communities now are mostly Latino, and there's no Latinos on this stage either to talk about that. But,
Okay,
you know,
lástima.
but, you know, I think that the media just sort of offers one way to look at the story, and that was a very frustrating thing for many Korean Americans.
Justin, you were, what, 10, 11 years old in 1992? And your dad was a shopkeeper in the affected area, and he also plays a shopkeeper in your film. What was it like for you, and how worried were you about your dad at that point?
So when it happened, I was 11. We lived in the suburbs. Because, you know, my dad was trying to provide public school for me and my sister. So when it happened, my dad had a shop in East Compton / Paramount, right next to the 710 freeway, and we didn't know when it started. You know, we saw everything on the news. The first day was you know, really crazy, and then you know, my dad was just tracking it, and then finally he just picked up and went to the store. So when you're talking about these guys with rifles and stuff on the roof, that was my dad. You know, he
Was he packing?
Yeah. So he was there, and you know, we ended up getting looted on the last day, and yeah, it was like a tornado just came through and you know, wrecked the place. But as an 11-year-old, you don't think about why it happened. You don't really think about those kind of things. It was more immediate things as a kid. Does this mean I have to move? Does this mean I have to make new friends? Does this mean, what does this mean? And that was sort of the questions we asked my parents. But that is why, part of the reason I wanted to make the film is it was a different processing the event as an adult. And also, you know, there were a lot of other narrative features being made about the uprising, and I read some of the scripts, and I felt like, wow, you know, the Korean experience and the Korean American experience was not represented as heavily as it should be. So I felt that if I, with the capabilities I had, if I didn't make, if, at least from my perspective, I'd feel extremely guilty. And as far as my dad, you know, he's never ever had any hatred or anything towards any group of people after this. He was just, you know, when I told him I wanted to make this film, he was just confused. He just wondered, why would you want to revisit such a traumatic time in our life? And I explained that's exactly why. You know, it needs to be, you know, it needs to be told from a Korean perspective. And I can't wait to see the other ones because I respect those filmmakers. But that was the sole purpose why I decided to do it. But yeah, you know, my dad, he's in the film, and it was a cathartic thing as well. Like just having our family having been through that, for us to, you know, kind of work it out on screen was something that was really sort of amazing for me.
It's impossible to look at the black girl in the film, Camilla, without thinking of Latasha Harlins. She's played by Simone Baker, and I don't have to tell you she's quite a scene stealer. Yeah. Why did you write that character into your movie?
Well, I mean, this goes beyond just you know, the LA riots, but you know, when I was writing the film, I wanted to represent, you know, demographics that are really underrepresented in film, which are Asian American males and African American females. So originally that role was Kamal, and it was a boy. But I just thought, you know, what a fantastic opportunity to show a resilient, you know, African American female as one of the leads. That was the main reason. But, you know, if you watch the film, there is a scene where Mr. Kim, the liquor store owner, pulls a gun. And yeah, that is a direct reference to Latasha Harlin. But, you know, I didn't want the whole film to revolve around that. It was around these people's narratives and them coexisting in these neighborhoods. So, but you're right, that it is in the film.
Dan and TJ, your film opens with a quote from Frederick Douglass, the guy that Donald Trump has heard a lot of good things about lately. Only problem is I think the quote came from 1852. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and the future. Here's my question. After all this stuff and looking at the current scene with the Black Lives Matter movement, have we really learned from the past? Or is the only thing we learn from history the fact that we don't learn anything from history?
I don't know if we're the ones to answer that question.
I mean, I'll say that quote comes from a speech that Frederick Douglass made celebrating the 4th of July, where he was asked by a community in New York to give a speech. And the full text of it is incredible. I mean, what he's saying there could be spoken today, and it wouldn't feel like much has changed. In terms of well, I mean, there's many things addressed in that speech, but even the kind of cognitive dissonance of his living existence at that time, of being asked to give this speech when anyone like him wouldn't even be, is not technically free at that point in our country. So anyways, I mean, just the simple fact that his speech could be delivered now, and I don't think anybody would skip a beat, maybe answers that question.
Right. You have a clip from 1965 in which CBS newsman Charles Kuralt is quoting Police Chief Parker, quote, he described Negro rioters as monkeys in a zoo. To what degree did the racist history of Chief Parker carry over with Chief Gates in 1992, in the year of the uprising?
I'm not dodging the question, but I'd venture to say that in the same way that the legacy and the history of slavery in this country, right? It's not, I don't know if I can actually like quantify it versus like and it ties into the first question you asked, which is this notion of have we actually learned from our past? And I think the easy answer I think it's not. I think there's one thing to ask a question about progress, but I think the easy answer about explicitly learning from our past, absolutely not. And I think that's actually kind of the structure. At the risk of sounding like overly pretentious, we thought of our film more as a piece of art. So like, it's almost like, can we create an experience that's almost holding up a mirror to America versus, you know, and using 65 and 92 in those events as, without sounding overly clinical, as more like case studies. And then you as an audience can actually extrapolate those, have a conversation with the material, and then ask those types of questions. And then you can go and read the New York Times in the morning, or be awoken by devastating news about another acquittal, and you're connecting those dots to not just 92, but 65, and maybe that even inspires you to look even further deeper into our history. So, you know, again, I can't specifically say, you know, the passing of the torch from Parker to Gates. You know, I can't really quantify what racist legacy was passed on without just saying, like, that's kind of the fabric of the country, and those roles of power. So, like I said, I'm not trying to dodge the question, but.
Yeah, but we've seen plenty of evidence that it's not unique to LA, obviously.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sasha, at one point in your film, you have this interesting back and forth with Police Chief Charlie Beck, the current LAPD chief, and he's talking about how he was working undercover when he was a young officer, I guess dressed kind of hippy-dippy drug dealer type, and how often he got stopped by his fellow officers. And I think he was doing that as a way of sort of building a bridge to you, as sympathizing with blacks who get stopped a lot by the cops. But was he sort of missing something in all that?
I mean, he wasn't missing anything, because that's the way people think. That's why I didn't interrupt him. That's why I let him complete his thoughts. You know, this is, in his own way, he really was trying to connect and relate to me. But if you listen to what he said, based on the way I look and the way I drove my car, I got pulled over hundreds of times. There's no way I would ever be pulled over hundreds of times. I would be below a prison. I would not have the opportunity to be pulled over hundreds of times. So just start with that. So because you have long hair and you look like a hippie, you got pulled over hundreds of times. Is that the same as someone who gets pulled over once and murdered by a police officer after he says, okay, I have a gun, I'm not going to shoot you? So it was an interesting exchange with myself and Mr. Beck.
Charlie Beck wrote an op-ed piece in the LA Times in which he said, after years of trying to arrest our way out of the problem, it became obvious that our efforts only contributed to the violence. Worse yet, they alienated the police to the point that, in respect, the riot was inevitable. Have guys like Charlie Beck and his predecessor, Bill Bratton, been able to change that core paramilitary culture of the LAPD?
I mean, it just doesn't work. So I think there's enough awareness that we all know that it doesn't work. You have to have some kind of new rap to go with what's going on. And I think it's going to take time for that rap that they have to catch up with the realities of the way they police people. So it's good PR.
Yeah. Grace, when I was going through your website, the one thing that struck me that the unheard voices in the mainstream media at the time were the peacemakers in the Korean community, and I listened to some of them at length about how they were trying to build bridges to the black community. How effective do you think they were in the immediate aftermath of '92 and going forward? How are relations today between the Korean and black communities?
Well, again, I mean, they're huge communities.
Yeah,
I mean, I think there's definitely, for example, there's an organization called Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance, which started a month before April 1992, and originally they were, you know, dealing with low-wage immigrant workers in Koreatown, and when April '92 happened, you know, and Koreatown sort of blew up, they realized that, oh, we don't live in this insulated society anymore. I think that was a kind of reckoning, like I said before, for a lot of Korean Americans, like, oh, we live in we don't live in a ghetto. I mean, we do live in a ghetto, but we actually have to deal with the larger society and how they view us. And Kiwa, Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance, eventually, is now called Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance because they organize specifically with Latino and Korean immigrant low-wage workers because that's who lives in Koreatown for the most part. And I think there's a lot of, I went to several events at the 25th anniversary, and there's several, there's a lot of things happening in different parts of the city. And I think this year, the 25th anniversary, is the first time that there were actually like multi-ethnic community organizing groups that have since sort of built up since 1992 because of what had happened, and realized we need to organize together. All of this stuff is affecting, inequality is getting even more extreme in Los Angeles, and I think that, conditions, considering, the current administration, what's happening with like ICE raids, everything, it's not gonna work if we don't all work together, and I think that was sort of the tenor of a lot of the events I was attending.
Justin, go to Rotten Tomatoes, look up your film Gook, you get 100% rating, which is the maximum. And many of the critics compare you favorably to a young Spike Lee. What do you think of those comparisons, and is Spike Lee one of your influences?
I mean, I grew up watching Spike films, and, obviously he's awesome. But this film in particular wasn't, I mean, God, I guess it's just osmosis, because I purposely made an effort not to watch Do the Right Thing, because, there are similar motifs in the film. And a more direct reference to this film is La Haine, and that's actually the film that was more of a similar situation to me, at least. But I mean, that comparison, I mean, what do I say to that? I mean, like, it's, and, and as for the rating, I mean, that's off of like, I don't know, 7 reviewers. It's gonna go down. I mean,
Yeah.
So I'm not even, but I'm not even thinking about that. But I guess it's very American. Like you talk about race relations in film, and all of, like, that's the first person they're gonna compare you to, and I mean,
Dan and TJ, you made your film completely out of archival material. Describe your kind of work process. It must have entailed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of screening this stuff and securing rights and all that. How do you guys work together? What kind of synergy do you try to
You
establish?
say goodbye to all your friends
Yeah.
and your family.
We work, I don't know, I think we were saying backstage, very haphazardly. There's no real plan ever. In terms of like our working together, we sit in the same room, always have, and we have 2 editing systems, and we cut at the same time, and it's sometimes efficient, sometimes very inefficient, because one will be like, oh, look at this, or, while somebody else is in a flow. For this in particular, I mean, we don't know for sure, but it was probably like close to like 2,000 hours of footage or something like that. And that was just like, because of our time schedule, there was at a certain point, I was gonna make an attempt to try to watch all of it, and I think I got through like 600 hours of footage or something like that, or 700. It was just like, this is never gonna happen because we have a deadline we need to actually cut the film. So, I think though, by the end we were able, at least one of us, to get our eyes on everything. Yeah, maybe not.
Sorta.
I don't know. There's all that. But
I
that was
think
it. I mean,
collectively, between, because we had a lead researcher, and we had, we did have another editor, and then we had an assistant editor and a couple other researchers and assistants. And I think collectively, we came to a point at some point during the process, and it was like, look, here's the deal. Ideally, one of us would get our eyes on all 2,000 hours. But it was kind of came to the point where collectively we're all going to see all 2,000 hours, and everyone's going to start having to put on their like note-taking caps. And if you see something that's just a gem, you're just going to have to notify us. Because at a certain point, we were really just up against a deadline. Because we were trying to finish. When we jumped on board this, we were in the middle of trying to finish another film, which is still shelved.
Grace, I found that when I was looking at your website, I could kind of run my mouse over all these little windows on the screen and hear different voices as the mouse went to different parts of the screen. And I'm just wondering, you know, an old guy like me might experience your site in a different way from a millennial who might be, you know, jumping from one thing to another very rapidly, whereas somebody like me might just sit there and listen to the entire clips and then go to the next one. What sort of user experience did you have in mind when you designed all that?
So if people go to ktown92.com, not here on your phones, but at a desktop or a laptop later,
Yeah.
it doesn't work on mobile. What happens is that teaser video starts, and then this video player just starts throwing different clips up. And they're not that long. The clips are maximum 3 minutes. And just a jumble
That's
of
quo
different-
vadis length in TV news, by the
Yeah.
way, where the average soundbite runs 7 to 10 seconds.
Right. Okay. So basically, different clips come from like five different sources, which is 1992 news footage, 1992 footage shot by independent filmmakers from LA, interviews that I did in 2017, B-roll of 2017 stuff that we've been shooting like in Koreatown and around, and kind of there's no. It's almost like as different clips come up, other clips start populating the screen, and you can either choose to listen to that one clip, or you might want to switch over and listen to somebody else. But most people, I think, watch at least a clip all the way through, and each of these clips sort of are commenting on each other in some way, or at least somehow related. But there's no, it sort of flattens the idea that there's going to be an expert on this event, and an expert that's going to tell you exactly what to think. However, I've chosen the kinds of interviews that you're going to see, or the kinds of people I interviewed in 2017 who you probably have not heard from in terms of this 1992 story, because it's not news, it's not the government, it's not police, it's people who live in these communities. And I think that I've gotten a really wide range of responses, because somebody like you who really knows what happened in 1992, you might skip over like the news footage, or you might just go to the person that you're interested in, like the peacemaker or whatever. Somebody like my son just wants to watch LA burning, like fires and police and stuff like that. But it's a wide mix, and at any given point, you can go to the index and see all of these different clips and choose who you want to look at. So it's a kind of choose your own adventure type of thing, but hopefully you get a more sort of complete picture as you're staying on the site for any number of minutes or hours.
Justin, I have to ask, why did you decide to call your film Gook?
I mean, it just, for me, racially, right off the bat, people don't understand what that even means. Most Americans have no idea that that's actually it means country in Korean. So Gook, it means America, but it actually means beautiful country. Mi means beautiful, Gook means country. And growing up being called that, it's just such a kind of confusing thing. And it's explained in the movie, and that's the thing, is people think it's some sort of ploy for shock, and it's not. I mean, it's in the neighborhood in the film, they're being called this name, and the girl, I use it as a moment of education. The girl, Camilla, she asked, "Hey, what does that even mean?" And I explained it to her, but I don't explain it to her with any sort of like, I hate that they call me this or any of that. It's just very, straight. This is what it means. And it was important to me that the power of that word is just, it's nuts. I mean, I just feel like, why is my own word from my own, culture being taken and bastardized like that?
Sasha, you alluded to the fact that you called your film Burn, Motherfucker, Burn because you wanted to convey the sense of outrage and anger that was present.
There's also a great song that has the refrain, burn,
Right.
motherfucker, burn, so, it's easy.
What did the rap lyrics of that day and the hip-hop music convey that we missed in the media?
Well, you know, in doing the research on this film, looking at the media and how these stories were told through mainstream media gave me a new appreciation for the hip-hop music that technically was reporting. You know, in my film, there's a Caucasian reporter who's in Koreatown speaking to two young shop owners, and he's saying, so when people of another color come in cars to your neighborhood, does that scare you? You know, the way the whole conversation is framed creates this sensational vibe and just pushes the conversation in places where it shouldn't go. Some might argue that hip hop did the same thing, you know, but hip hop was coming from a very specific perspective. You know, when Ice Cube did a song called Black Korea, you know, I grew up in New York. I grew up with Koreans all the time. Like, we got along just fine. You know, the issues that they were having in Los Angeles with store owners and stuff, I learned about it through the music. So in a lot of ways, I learned about what was happening in Los Angeles through the music in a way that I could connect with it, in a way that was different from the way mainstream media was talking about what was happening. So as the nice Asian folks in my film, a rapper, going back to your question earlier about how have things changed in the community, you know, what are Black and Korean relations like now? Well, you have young Korean rappers who grew up inside of hip hop culture, who use hip hop as a mode of expression and as a platform to talk about their own experiences in America. So hip hop has always been a platform for multiple people to use to report. And so I think the music that I was listening to on the East Coast, Ice Cube and a lot of other folks were great reporters for what was happening.
Great. I'd like to give audience members a chance to ask some questions. Anybody got a question for our panel up there?
Well, when you see the diversity of the folks here, I think their experiences are translated in these films, whether they're consciously thinking about it or not. For instance, in my own experience, my last name is Jenkins. My dad was a brother from Philly, but my mom is from Haiti, and she came here as an immigrant. So I can relate to the Korean experience. I understand the immigrant's perspective on America, while I also understand the African American perspective on the way African Americans have been treated. And so if you look at where we are now with the types of folks who have these opportunities, I think if you look at these films, what you're talking about is actually there. At least I was trying to be very conscious of having that kind of balance in the film that I made.
I agree. I mean, I think especially for, you know, talking about anti-Blackness in Asian or immigrant communities, Latino communities, I mean, we have to talk about Latasha Harlins and Sunja Du, and we have to talk about that because a lot of people just don't want to talk about it, right? Or just brush it under the rug. Why do you have to bring that up? It was really important for me to include that in K-Town 92 and you know, including stories, even though it's called K-Town 92, again, questioning what is even K-Town, you know? What is even South LA? Like, there are many different people living in all of these communities. And, you know, I think that's just what I, like, you know, in some ways, having that experience of witnessing how the news in the United States and in Korea sort of turned it into a Black riot and then sort of pitted all these groups against each other was very confusing to me because I have, you know, like close friends from many different kinds of backgrounds. And it was part of, you know, it sort of has shaped even the way that I make films or the kinds of films I want to make or the conversations that I want to have. So, you know, I think that we need to keep doing that, and I appreciate that you brought that up. So, thanks.
There was a question up here.
It's a good question because, you know, I think there's a misconception that cinema or art actually is the thing that creates the change. I think it can inspire, and I think it can help facilitate the right conversation. I truly believe that. I don't think it is the pillar of change. So I think it's a slippery slope. Meaning, if we don't have the kind of conversation that we're having right now in this room, we are able to communicate and guide it in the way in which hopefully we're all learning from each other. And you want that to, you hope for that, for the material to speak on its own behalf, so that happens time and time and time again. But that's, you can't really, you never know if that's gonna be the case. The other part of your question is, you can never not, like, as much as we're trying to create it's certainly not creating an objective space. We get pretty editorial with our film, but as much as you're trying to create a space to say, the guiding principle here is emotion and empathy, it's still filtering through our lens and our conversation, and we are one facet of a form of media. You can't deny that, but I think the best thing you can do is be conscious of it. And in being conscious of it, hopefully you're making more informed decisions when you're actually, when you're actually presenting your work. Because there's that, as democratized as the medium has become, it's still a form of power to have this platform to share our perspective of these events, of this history, right? And I think the more that we can just continue to acknowledge that and have that conversation, then hopefully it's the better. But yeah, I think it's a great question.
I'll speak for myself only. I have very conflicted thoughts in going in. I had a very cursory knowledge of this. I was born in the Midwest and was 13 years old at the time, and knew as much as I kind of gleaned from the news maybe at that time. So going in and researching and reading, I have very conflicted thoughts, and a lot of, which is what we tried to do in the film, is create a sense of cognitive dissonance within the film. Like, I personally don't believe in violence, but I also see why oftentimes that is the only way that people can get attention. Or also, when you are stuck in an irrational situation, how you might make what some people would consider not rational, or if rational is defined as like thinking beyond just the immediate thing in front of you. So me personally, I don't know. I see things that I go, oh, that led to, like, in maybe a particular instance that led to some sort of positive change, but are the means the right way? That is a question I personally can't answer, other than I recognize all of those conflicting things.
I mean, so many people look at what happened as being very un-American, right? But what is American history? All it is violence. All it is people taking what they want, or our founding fathers fighting for what is theirs and what they deserve, and that's what America is. So when you think about all the focus that's put on it and the scrutiny that goes into it, how come that same scrutiny doesn't go further back in different aspects of American history? Well, I think we know the answer.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I totally understand the question. I don't think it's about being positive or negative, or I don't know if that's necessarily, maybe it's just not the right verbiage. I think it's about, Sasha's film has you've got a lot of information in that film, right? And I think it's a lot of information that people just have no idea about.
Context. It's a lot of context.
Context, content, really important material that is, it's unfortunate that that's not more common knowledge or taught in schools. And so I think, like our films would complement each other in the sense that it's not about positive or negative outlooks. It's about, I think the intention by the information he's sharing in his film, and then us consciously being like, can we preserve emotion? Can empathy be the guiding force? The idea is, let's not have this happen again, I think, in our hearts. But let's also not deny the reality of the socioeconomic stratification that we have in this country that we don't want to talk about. So we can't be surprised if it were to happen again. And here's an opportunity to discuss a recent event that absolutely shaped this city and absolutely shaped this country.
What about the innocent people who were victims of what happened? What about the Popeye's fried chicken guy who watched his stand being burned down and said, "I'm from the ghetto. This is wrong. This shouldn't be happening"? What about the Korean lady whose dry cleaning establishment was cleaned out by looters who probably took a lot of the Sunday best clothing of the people in the black community? What about all of the folks who didn't deserve to have what happened to them happen? What do we say to them?
Again, I think actually one of the problems our country is faced with is our inability to exist in a space where we can have complicated thoughts in our head. Like, we just want like simple answers, or like it's this or it's that. Yeah. And I mean, to Sasha's point, part of our country is founded on the lie of America, right? And like we don't want to. We just want it like wrapped up real neat for us. And I mean, I personally, it's a tragedy. Like, that would be all. I can't imagine if I'm myself and I have a store and it's my life's work and it's burned to the ground. But I would hope I could also, and maybe I wouldn't be able to, I have no idea, but I would hope I would also be able to be aware enough to go, well, I understand that there is frustration. I don't want my store to be burned down. I don't think this is the way to do it, but I get that. And so how do we talk about this stuff so that, you know, the ways of expression that can hurt individual, what you're saying, innocent people, that doesn't happen again?
I don't know if I have to say anything to them, but I think I need to listen to them and what their experience was, and understand something about, you know, their reality. And I think that that's not what we get when we, you know, one of the reasons when you guys are talking, when Sasha, when you said, you know, you heard about all these films being made, I think when I heard about all these films being made, I was like, I got to do something, because nobody commissioned me to make a film about 1992. So I'm just going to do this and put it on the internet. But I really felt that. Like, I felt like, who is listening to people who don't have a voice? I mean, we have a platform, but there's so many people who, you know, have stories that, you know, there's this, I'll share one story. I made this other film about this activist, Grace Lee Boggs, and there was a young Korean American woman who came to the screening, and she was so amazed that she never knew that there were like Asian Americans who were like activists in the 60s and working in civil rights and Black Power. And she said, let's have a coffee because I want to tell you about a story. And I said, okay. And she said, you know, we met up, and she said, have you ever heard of the LA riots? And I was like, of course. And she said, I never knew what that was until I took a class at UCLA in Asian American Studies, and I was doing a research paper on, you know, I was writing a paper on it, and I found the FEMA book in the library, and I discovered my parents' and my grandparents' names. Their stores were burnt down in the riots, and I never knew about it. And you know, that's how much people don't talk about it. Like, her parents never mentioned it to her. She had to take this class, learn about it. Maybe, you know, now she can watch these films or like look at the website and understand, you know, something about what happened here. And that was really moving to me. It was really disturbing and sad that this event that, you know, changed the course of her life wasn't even part of her consciousness.
More questions from the audience? Yeah.
I mean, the internet, on my, you know, my film's called Burn, Motherfucker, Burn. People just saw that, didn't even watch it, and just said that I'm all kinds of mean things, and I'm un-American, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. All I can do is say, I don't really care what they think. I mean, I got to make a film called Burn, Motherfucker, Burn. Like, that's crazy. Showtime paid for it, thank you, Showtime, you know? So you got, you know, in life you have to count your victories, and you have to stick with your convictions and put out there what you put out there. I mean, like, I wouldn't want to be a kid now with like cyberbullying and like the internet. I'm not on internet. I don't do Facebook. I don't do Instagram. I'm not judging anyone here, but like, I don't want to see photos of your food, especially since There are people around the world who don't have food. I don't want to see photos of your sneakers because there are people who don't have shoes, right? And so we're in this society where everyone has an opinion, everyone has a platform, and that's great. But at a certain point, I don't really care. Like, I'm focused on what I have to say, focused on the people I work with, and I'm sure the folks up here are the same way. And I think, you know, obviously, we all should be that way.
So, Sasha, what was the meeting with the Showtime people like where you said, I'm going to call it Burn, Motherfucker, Burn?
I don't remember.
Did you say to them, hey, it's pay cable, we can talk dirty? What did you say? I mean,
Well,
what was it
just think
like?
I was in the process of trying to figure it out, and there were all these other films. Like, how am I going to separate myself from everyone else? You know, what am I going to call it? Burn, guys, burn, or you know?
Well, in
Set the
65, it
roof
was
on
Burn,
fire.
Baby, Burn.
Yeah. Well, that was the old.
That was the
one.
old school.
Yeah. Now the song,
Yeah.
I try to make things that are true to the core of the community that I represent, right? But I try to also open up the conversation. So for those who aren't a part of the community, they can participate and understand. So for me, the song that has the refrain, you know, the roof is on fire, we don't need no water, let the motherfucker burn, burn, motherfucker, burn. In every urban center in America, there's been a house party when that's been like the apex of the party. So I guess there's a marketing mind in me that's thinking, all right, the black people are going to check it out because it's got a refrain that they know. But ultimately, again, I was trying to crystallize the way people feel. Because going back to what you were talking about earlier, and unfortunately, the lack of education and the things people don't know, if you look at my Watts uprising footage and you look at 92, it's happening in the same neighborhood for the exact same reason. And the way fashion works, it's cyclical. So some of those guys in 65 can be guys in 2017 the way they dress. You know, it's all cyclical. So if these young folks don't even know about what happened in 92, their families aren't even telling them that their own families were directly connected to what's happened, they're definitely not going to know about 65. I mean, I produced some stuff for MTV some years ago, and they're like, yeah, don't go any further back than 1989. The kids aren't going to understand what you're talking about. So there's a real, where if we Americans understood American history,
Yeah.
that's the bigger conversation. If we understood American history, some things could maybe change, but America's not interested in Americans understanding American history because America would be portrayed for what we are, hypocrites. Again, it goes to this narrative of separating folks instead of embracing us as Americans. My people have been here for hundreds and hundreds of years. Why do I not have the same, why do I feel like I don't have the same rights as someone else who hasn't been here as long as me? If I'm playing the American game, you haven't been here as long as me. You didn't build the White House. You didn't do all these things. How come I don't feel the way you as a white American who might only be here for a generation and a half? Why do you have why do you have greater rights than I do? Or at least why is the perception is that you do?
Yeah. I feel kind of cheated because when I was growing up in school, we never learned diddly squat about blacks or Latinos.
probably
or
still that way.
Native Americans.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate reality. But I think this all comes back to the question, which I think was a great question, because often the conversation that's happening in this room, essentially kind of what you're asking is, how do you make sure that that conversation transcends into, predominantly a white community, and is going to be accepted and is going to be embraced and is going to facilitate some form of dialogue versus the conversation staying in this bubble right here between like-minded, I'm assuming like-minded folks. And I think that's an ongoing challenge. I think as it relates to specifically the work, I think it depends on what your intention is. I know for us specifically, story and the material comes first with the intention to absolutely elicit a conversation. That was, if you think about reverse engineering when we first got approached of doing the film, that was one of the conversations we had, is actually how do you, for example, how do you create a space where you're touching on all of these things, but you can do it with someone who has a different political ideology than you. So for us, it was, I would have loved to interview Danny Bakewell, but if, in our assessment going into it, if you had Danny Bakewell sit down, you might immediately turn off someone of a different political leaning, and they're just like, I'm sick of hearing this guy talk about the events of '92. I know where he sits, I know where he stands, and that's it. And immediately you start losing your audience. So we've been pretty lucky in the sense that in touring the film, we've just had some random people come up to us with totally different political leanings who maybe they don't understand fully everything that was going on, but it seems to kind of like cut through it, and they have actually vocalized this notion of thank you for not almost like filtering the information through kind of individuals that we've seen talk about this material or these events before. But in doing so, it gave them an opportunity to sit through the full film and actually garner a sense of empathy for the Korean American experience or the Korean merchant experience, et cetera, and facilitated a dialogue that we had with them. Again, different political leanings. Maybe we veered in that conversation a few times and didn't agree with some stuff, but at least we were having that conversation. And I think that is always the challenge, is how do you make sure you're having that conversation and not just the conversation stays in kind of in a bubble.
But I'll just say, but having the conversation in a place that's informed, so that people actually, you're not, to Sasha's point, like how you have to understand history.
But you said earlier, you talked about a merchant's shop, dry cleaners, whether it's Korean or African American shop that was burned down, and you said, what about all the Sunday best that might have been lost in one of those fires, right? Do you guys know what Sunday best really means? Church clothes, right? But do you know where it comes from before that? It was mandated in certain states that slave owners had to buy their slaves one nice church outfit so they could worship a God that was completely foreign to them. That's what Sunday best means. But it's it's as an American, you use it, Sunday best, it means church
I learned
clothes.
something just now.
Right, it means church clothes, but it means something much deeper than that. And the other film I made, not to plug it, but I'm hip-hop, Fresh Dressed, when I try to tell stories, I try to introduce this information so you understand where you sit in American history. And so Sunday best, feel free to continue to use it. Just know that your ancestors, if you are an African American, that's when they got their nice church suit from their slave master.
Wow.
Uppity?
Yeah.
I mean, that's why it matters who's telling the story, I think.
Yeah.
It's not just content, it's also whose perspective is framing these stories for you, giving you context.
Well, I fear that we have run out of time. I want to thank our panel for a very spirited discussion. Thank all of you for joining in. Good night.